This is DW News. I'm Nicole Frillich. Welcome to Ask DW, the show that's all about your questions. Today, we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine and where it stands over 800 days into Russia's full-scale invasion. And we want your input. It's super easy to get involved. If you're not already there, just go to our YouTube page. The address is there on your screen. There, you'll see the show. It's called Ask DW. Is Ukraine losing control of the battlefield? And you can click on that, and you can type away in the chat. This time, you can pick the brains of these two men. That is DW's longtime Kyiv correspondent Nick Connolly and DW's Russia analyst Konstantin Egad. Good to have you guys on the show. Now, these guys really know their stuff and are so keen to hear from you. So keep your questions and comments coming. While you're thinking up some questions, though, let's take a look at what's happening right now in Ukraine. What we know is that the front lines are slowly shifting as Ukrainian forces struggle to hold back a wave of Russian assaults in the east of the country. What you're watching here is drone footage of a Ukrainian town called Chasiv Yar. It was once home to 12,000 people, and now it's deserted and largely destroyed, as you can see. For months, it's been the target of Russian artillery and aircraft. Russia is determined to seize control of it. Capturing it would give them control of a strategically important hilltop. From there, their artillery could dominate the battlefield far and wide. But before we get to our experts, we want to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture, because Moscow says it has captured several hundred square kilometers of Ukrainian territory this year alone. In February, Kremlin troops seized the city of Avdiivka. And now Russian forces have their sights set on Chasiv Yar, that town that you just saw. It's a small but strategically vital place on the map. A Ukrainian defeat here could jeopardize the defense of the entire region. Well, Kyiv blames the setbacks on shortages of troops and delays in weapons deliveries from its allies in the West. The United States may have recently approved a $61 billion aid package, but that is by no means the end of Ukraine's troubles. Getting the weapons in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers is the next step. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine and its allies must pick up the pace. Let's listen.
Political decisions must be followed by real logistics, the actual receipt of the weapons by our soldiers. Work must be done around the clock with our partners, especially with the United States.
Let's find out what this all means for the war going forward. We've got Nick Connolly for the Ukrainian angle and Konstantin Egad, our Russia analyst, for the read on how developments are going down in Moscow. They're standing by to take your questions and comments. Of course, remember, you can submit those in the comments section on YouTube. Let's start with you, though, now, Nick, because you just returned from the front line close to Chasiv Yar. What did the soldiers defending the town tell you?
Well, it was extraordinarily difficult. We were there at a position that was basically out in the open on a kind of village road. There was a bit of hedgerow, some trees to helping them to disguise their positions, but basically for the entire time, you just heard artillery flying in all different directions. You had drones, Russian drones, above all the time we were there, and those people are acutely aware that they are a target, and the systems they have, these are basically 1970s Soviet-era weapons, guns, and armored vehicles, basically aren't up to the task unless the weather is really, really favorable, forcing those drones further down, making them easier to shoot down. So they were feeling very vulnerable. They knew they didn't really have any other option, and that they basically were there to make sure that Russia has as difficult a time taking Chasiv Yar as is possible. But they were really looking to the West and asking themselves when this money that has been promised and now signed off on was actually going to arrive, when these resources, when the artillery shells would actually start making a difference. Because they had seen a different situation. In 2023, when Ukraine had its counteroffensive, for a while, Ukraine almost reached parity in munitions, in artillery shells, and now it felt like they were back to square one, back to the situation they'd faced in 2022 in terms of having to see the Russians firing 6, 7, or even 10 shells for every one they had.
Konstantin, we're 2 days away from Russia's Victory Day, when Russia commemorates the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. It's widely believed that Vladimir Putin wants to present some sort of victory on that historically important date. Could the capturing of Chasiv Yar be it?
Yes, to some extent, although I do think that the main goal of Putin is actually to distract Russians from the war. Chasiv Yar is not Kharkiv or Dnipro or any kind of big Ukrainian city that is well known to the Russian population. And the capture of which would have been presented as a major victory. Here, I think it is important for Putin just to say that we continue to eat, we, Russia, continue to eat at the traditionally Russian-speaking and traditionally Russian areas of Ukraine. We continue to, quote-unquote, liberate them. That is the Kremlin's rhetoric now. And I suppose that Chasiv Yar, as such, is not that important. The important thing is to say that we continue to grind on, we continue to basically reduce the size of Ukrainian state. I think that is the main message. Otherwise, Chasiv Yar is not something that the Russians know anything about. So I'd say it is the movement that is more important for Putin than specific names and positions.
Yeah, Nick, President Zelensky has said time and time again that he wants to defend every inch of Ukrainian territory. So if it's true that, Chasiv Yar doesn't really matter all that much to the Russians as a whole, what would it mean for Ukrainians to lose the town of Chasiv Yar?
I think I divide here between the kind of Putin's logic for maybe his own, the population in Russia who, as Konstantin says, don't know about Chasiv Yar. It's not a famous place, as Avdiivka wasn't a particularly well-known place. But I think there is maybe, a need for the military to kind of explain to itself what it's doing in Ukraine and, give itself these kind of milestones in terms of their land grab in Ukraine. I think in terms of the Ukrainian kind of vision of all this, I think they are just very conscious that the geography means Chasiv Yar, because it's a bit higher up, because it is basically between two kind of logistical routes into the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donetsk region, that would really make their future defense of the rest of that part of the country a lot harder, and that it would be a lot harder to kind of dig in after Chasiv Yar and try to kind of set up some new way of stabilizing the front line. So I think it's less about the symbolism from a Ukrainian point of view and more about the kind of nuts and bolts of how you go about slowing down this Russian advance. Avdiivka, for instance, that was the beginning of this Russian kind of run in February, that was had been basically surrounded by the Russians on three sides for a long time. So that was always going to be very tough to try and defend that. Whereas with Chasiv Yar, there's a feeling the front lines are a bit more straight, a bit easier to defend, a bit less complicated, and it is a place that's worth investing significant resources in terms of material, but also in terms of lives, effectively, to keep that position.
Yeah. Nick, Konstantin, I'm going to take the back seat for now because we have our first user question. Our user 0.1 asks, how does Ukraine plan to get its goals in the 10-point peace plan if they won't be able to go on the offensive for the next year or more? What can be done to change the situation on the ground? Maybe we can start with you, Nick.
I mean, I think with all these kind of peace initiatives, I think it's a lot about the kind of court of international public opinion. I don't think anyone really here sees a clear route to enacting any of these peace plans, any kind of, direct step roadmap to how this would actually happen. But I think Ukraine has been stung by criticism that it is not doing enough, that it is basically just, demanding its maximalist position and isn't doing enough to listen to those countries around the world who are suffering under the kind of economic impacts of this war. And so it is important for Ukraine to be seen to be engaging, especially the global south, and offering ways to peace. But for now, when you speak to people here and you ask them, so what would be step one, step two, especially when they hear Vladimir Putin basically, still on his same maximalist demands that we heard in February of 2022, there isn't a lot of a sense that this is, in any way going to happen anytime soon. This is about showing willingness, showing openness, engaging other countries, apart from Ukraine's normal partners. But beyond that, I don't see a lot of substance to it for now.
Now, Konstantin, a lot of analysts agree that this war is likely to not be won on the battlefield. What would the Russian side be willing to concede to put an end to this once they run out of other options? Right now, they're on the offensive and it's looking good, but that has not always been the case. So what would a possible victory that is negotiated look like for Putin's Russia?
I do not think that Putin is thinking in such terms. I think he still continues to dream and consider it to be realistic to essentially replace the government in Kyiv with a much more pliant one and grab as much territory as he can. I mean, the issue now is that he cannot do much, and we see that these battles for Avdiivka, for Chasiv Yar, I mean, these are battles you can compare to the strange war of 2016, the trench warfare of the First World War. These are kind of, even if these are victories for the Russians, these are very small victories. And at the same time, I suppose that if you can talk about the kind of grand plan in Moscow, it is to wear Ukraine down with just demographic advantage. I think that Putin has taken a decision that he wouldn't care how many Russians are killed. He still has more of the Russians to be sent to the front than the Ukrainians have on their side. So I suppose that the idea is to continue to wear Ukraine down. That is why, by the way, today in his inauguration speech, Putin mentioned nothing about the war. Nothing about, negotiations. He mentioned the war by passing.
Plenty, yeah, we'll get to that later.
Yeah, and actually, I do think that he thinks he has a lot of time on his hands, and he has a lot of human resources. That these resources are going to be thrown into this meat grinder is completely unprepared, completely untrained. There are not enough officers and sergeants to train these people. He doesn't care about it. What he cares about is actually to continue to grab Ukrainian territory meter by meter. That is, I think, if we can talk about any kind of strategy, that is it.
Yeah, and now that you say that there is no real strategy and that the Russian military is very much working like a meat grinder, I do want to pull up something that the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence service told our colleagues over at The Economist. He said the Russian army is not the hubristic organization it was in 2022 and is now operating as a single body with a clear plan and under a single command. That is the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence service. So would you say that's not a correct assessment?
I would say that, first and foremost of all, I think that there is still some kind of unity of command. As a former officer, I can tell you, I do not see any kind of disintegration in the Russian command structure. What I mean is that Putin is conscientiously using the type of warfare that lots of people consider to be a thing of the past. Everyone's talking recently until 2022. Everyone was saying the nature of warfare has changed. It's all about technology. It's all about information. It's all about cyber. It's all about propaganda. No, it turned out that Putin thinks that good old trench warfare, good old frontal attacks by semi-trained soldiers is still fine. It still gets you the result. What is important, and I think that is something that is not really well understood in the West, and I think that actually that is what this Economist interview, the Ukrainian commander hinted at in his Economist interview. Putin just wages a type of warfare that the West thought was left in the past. And in this respect, he has an advantage because he's doing something that people did not think he's going to do. It's another matter, if we can look at the situation in Russia domestically, that Putin wants to continue to supply the army with new recruits without officially announcing it, because that is going to have an adverse effect on the population. So how long he'll be able to pull this trick off, not actually engaging, not making the population aware of the costs of war while still waging this war at the same time at a very bloody cost. I mean, it's a big question, but I think he still thinks he can pull it off.
Yeah. We have another user question, actually. Our viewer, Percy, has a question about the mobilization, because Ukraine is not only outgunned, it is also severely outmanned by the Russians. So he's asking, is mobilization working? I'm getting the feeling the politicians in Kyiv are pretending it's working, but in reality, it's not. Nick, what is the truth? Percy wants to know.
Well, certainly there was a long delay. Basically, we had 6 months of political wrangling here in Kyiv about the new mobilization law. Volodymyr Zelensky has finally signed it recently, and now people are, men in the relevant age categories are called upon to basically turn up at the military recruitment offices to restate their information so that basically the bureaucracy knows where they're living, what their health status is, all the other relevant information, so that then a new database can be created and people can be called up on a different scale. They've also reduced the minimum age. It was previously 27. It's now down to 25. Many people argue it should be down to 20. So they have finally taken this decision, but there has been a huge amount of criticism that Volodymyr Zelensky basically didn't want to risk his popularity with the electorate, with the citizens of this country, by forcing people to fight who didn't want to. If you remember back to the beginning of the war, he didn't have to. You had queues round the block in front of those recruitment offices in the first year. I've met soldiers on the front line who told me that it took them 12 or 15 attempts to actually finally find a unit that was willing to take them at the beginning. And now the situation is totally the opposite. They tried to go in without forcing people by modernizing recruitment and doing it like a kind of private sector way, with glossy online portals and different units offering different opportunities to develop yourself, to learn new skills, in the hope that that would bring in enough people to the army. And now they're having to resort to actually forcing people to turn up. And if you don't turn up, you're going to see your bank accounts frozen, you're going to see your driver's license no longer valid, that kind of bureaucratic pressure to get people to enter the system. But obviously they've wasted a lot of time, and now this is only starting now, so it's going to take quite some while before these people are trained and actually on the front lines.
A follow-up question from our user Idolize coming in there. Thank you for your questions, by the way. Keep them coming. There's a lot of movement in the chat. We have an eye on it. She wants to know, or he wants to know, even with more financial aid, Ukraine still needs soldiers. Is it realistic that more weapons alone can be a main factor here? What do you say, Nick?
I think Ukraine definitely needs both, and it's also important to stress that if you're in defense, right, you need fewer resources and also fewer people than if you're attacking. So different types, different phases of war require different resource bases. You obviously need a lot more if you're trying to take territory back, especially now in a situation where Russia, long stretches of the front lines, has dug in and laid minefields, as we saw very clearly demonstrated during that Ukrainian counterattack last summer that was so slow and didn't bring the results that had been hoped for. I think all along Ukraine has been trying to fight more cleverly, more modernly, in a more modern fashion than Russia is doing so. Obviously, in a democratic, free society like Ukraine's, where politicians care about their ratings and obviously have free elections to worry about, you will face a lot more pushback from society if you have large casualty figures, if you send people untrained to the front lines. And we're already seeing families of people who've been at the front lines for 2 years now making a lot of noise and putting a lot of pressure on the politicians here to give their relatives some time off. So we don't have a full overview of what resources Ukraine has. But I think, for now, those resources, those shells, basically, the nuts and bolts, the munitions for, normal artillery pieces, that is crucial. And for now, the kind of influx of Western resources is going to be enough. Whether, at present, Ukraine will be able to retake territory, we don't know. But certainly, both of these things are a big issue, and it is something that is incredibly controversial here in Ukrainian society. Lots of people wondering whether this is being carried out fairly, whether the right people are being sent to fight, and whether other people are getting out of fighting or hiding in Kyiv. And certainly when you talk to soldiers on the front lines, that's the first thing they'll tell you. When I go back to Kyiv for my 1 week's holiday, I have to see all these young men walking around with their gym bags, not in uniform. How come they're allowed to do that?
Yeah, there is a lot of interest in the chat in that topic, actually, Nick. And there's another question from our user TP. He writes, many young men in Ukraine are currently hiding from police services to avoid being forcefully conscripted. What does that say about the situation in the front line?
I'm not sure if that's specifically, because of the current situation on the front lines. And, the difference is that now there is a different level of pressure on people to turn up at those recruitment offices to, update their location and their other information. So we can't really compare it to the first year of the war, because there wasn't that pressure, there wasn't that government kind of bureaucracy trying to get people to turn up. I think this is a common feature of most wars. You see lots of people who don't want to fight. You see different levels of kind of repression against those who don't fight. The fact is, the law is as it is, and we have seen people leaving the country illegally, paying bribes, trying to get across the border, all kinds of things. But for the most part, that is maybe by some estimates of a few 100,000 men in a country of 40 million. It's difficult to get a kind of broader kind of zoom out picture of how big this phenomenon is, but certainly we are in a new phase now of the war, and lots of people are trying to understand what this new law means for them, and if they are called up to fight, will they be sent to the front line, or will they be able to say, okay, I'd prefer to go and be a paramedic, or I'd prefer to repair tanks somewhere away from the front lines. So you definitely see lots of people working out what this means for them, and some people saying, yes, I'm willing to face the consequences, I'm going to hide out and potentially end up in jail if I'm caught.
Yeah, let's bring Konstantin back in, because our user RKB wants to know, will we ever see NATO troops in Ukraine? What do you think, Konstantin?
Well, before I answer the question, I wanted to follow up on what Nick said. That's
sure.
very important. When he described the reaction of the Ukrainian society to the mobilization orders, to basically the President Zelensky's decision to enhance conscription. You look at the Russian side; it's completely different. In a sense, I think if you look at the what they call in Russia Z bloggers, the pro-war bloggers, they basically say that in these circumstances, that the fact that Russia is basically a society ruled from the top is an advantage, because there are no debates, there are no visible protests. There were some protests of the wives of those who were sent to the front for 1 year and then could not return, but these protests didn't make big waves in the society. So I think that the Kremlin, Putin's administration, they're looking at it and saying, well, by the way, you know what? It's our advantage that we are running the country along the lines we were running it along for 25 years. It's blind, it's compliant. And I think in this respect, that gives a certain advantage to Putin. You have to have huge losses, really massive losses for the Russian society to say, wait a minute. Now, with regard to the NATO troops, I suppose that so far, and of course Nick is on the ground, probably has more information, I suppose so far, there are not going to be any kind of any type of military personnel that are going to be engaged in specific warfare. What I can imagine is that there are advisors. There are already probably people that are overseeing repairs of technologically advanced weapons that were given to Ukraine. There may be, let's say, recently retired military people. Still, they possess all the skills of modern warfare. As for sending the troops there, let me put it like that. I think it's not yet the time, but I suppose that at least my sources during my recent trips to European capitals, I heard quite frequently that there are two things that NATO and NATO allies are prepared to do. First, massively invest in essentially what we can call a new arms race that will wear Russia down. And secondly, maybe in a situation in which the controlled command centers of Ukrainian state are under threat. Essentially, if the fate of the Ukrainian state is hanging in the balance, then I can imagine that Ukraine will use Article 51 of the UN Charter and ask for assistance. It can do that. Countries do not have to have multilateral arrangements along the lines of, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty, Article 5. A country can ask another country for a military help. And I suppose that in case the fate of the Ukrainian state hangs in the balance, I think, let me put it very cautiously, at least some Western capitals will consider it very seriously.
One of the Western capitals considering it very seriously and out in the open is Paris. I want to ask you, Nick, what do people in Ukraine think about President Macron talking openly about the possibility of European boots on the ground in Ukraine?
I mean, certainly it was very welcome, but when you speak to most experts, they're a little skeptical that this is, going to happen in the foreseeable future. They see this more as part of a kind of rhetorical effort by Macron and also to a different extent by the Brits to basically redirect the conversation. They see this as a situation where basically Russia, Putin, is always escalating, threatening, to train, you let his nuclear forces train, basically, threatening the use of these kinds of weapons indirectly. And on the other hand, the US and also Germany constantly, as the Ukrainians would see it, basically ruling things out and reducing their potential to kind of match that escalatory threat. So they're seeing this as an attempt by France and the UK as part of that NATO coalition that is helping Ukraine, trying to even out the kind of situation for Ukraine and to make it clear to the Russian side that, there are things that the West has still not yet done that could happen. We saw the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, in Kyiv recently saying that Ukraine could use UK-produced and supplied weapons against Russia itself, not just against Russian targets in occupied Ukraine. That is definitely new. That is something that hadn't been stated before and hadn't seemingly been communicated before. And that opens huge new opportunities for Ukraine to use some of the weapons they've already received to, for instance, attack Russian airfields that are used to bomb places like Kharkiv every day and that are pretty close to the border, that are within range of existing weapons that have been supplied, and that could potentially make things a lot easier for Ukraine rather than spending huge amounts of resources, trying to shoot down every missile. They could just, attack it at source, attack the planes that are used to launch those missiles, attack the airfields. So I think there is a sense that that imbalance has been recognized by the West and that France and the UK are trying to kind of shift the balance in Ukraine's favor.
Mm-hmm. Konstantin, that much talked about strategic ambiguity that Macron is stirring there. Does that bother anyone in the Kremlin?
Well, look, I don't live in the Kremlin, probably likely for me, but I think that I'd say looking from where I am, and I'm in Lithuania, I'm in Central Europe, people here in Warsaw, in Riga, actually in Helsinki too, are saying the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. As someone who was much better at rhetoric than I am said once. I think that this strategic ambiguity, at least looking from the Central European perspective, could be much more ambiguous and much more dangerous, because that is what Putin doesn't like and what his entourage do not like, because they know that Russia will be helpless against the full sort of force of Western economies if they start to produce weapons in sufficient numbers to supply Ukrainians and actually to threaten Russia too. And secondly, I think that they will be loath to see more of the Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. I think that we've been focusing on this very difficult battle for Chasiv Yar, but we need to remember that the Ukrainians, with the help of Western weapons, managed to single-handedly demobilize and immobilize the Black Sea Fleet of Russia. They managed to actually depopulate the Crimea, where significant parts of the population have left under threats of Ukrainian strikes. Ukrainians managed to basically free up all the commercial routes via which Ukrainian grain is being exported. And finally, and that is very important, pretty much daily strikes at the Russian energy infrastructure are becoming increasingly visible and increasingly dangerous for Russian energy exports. Moreover, what they show that Putin is not omnipotent. He cannot control the whole of Russian territory. Ukraine still can strike. And I think that this is something that over time may have an effect. And in case Ukraine gets more weapons, in case Ukraine gets more Western supports, then these strikes, along the lines of those that David Cameron described in Kyiv, and strikes with Western weapons against legitimate targets situated in Russia proper. Of course, over time, it will have an effect. And I think that this is something that really jars Putin very, very significantly.
Yeah, there is a lot of interest still in the chat in Ukraine's recruiting problem. Gustavo Palos asks, has the Ukrainian patriotism we saw in February of 2022 vanished? We saw lines of men enlisting in the army. You mentioned it there, Nick, and some even coming back to the country to join the fight. What changed, Nick?
I don't think anything changed in the sense those people who were willing to go immediately, who maybe had experience of fighting after 2014 in that conflict in the Donbass, those people who kind of had an easy route in, they are already fighting and have been doing so for 2 years. So now this is just, a different group of people who, many of whom say, I will go and fight when my country asks me to, but I'm not going to recruit and, be recruited and go earlier than I'm asked. And who often don't have any military experience, who often obviously worried that, they'll immediately end up on the front lines 200, 300 meters away from the opposing Russian positions, who maybe don't have a very realistic expectation of the army, that there are lots of other jobs there, especially if you go and look for them. So I think that is a process, a kind of shift that was expected by everyone, that isn't particularly surprising. But it doesn't make it easier, and especially, as Konstantin kind of alluded to there, in a free society like Ukraine, unlike Russia, you're going to have protests, you're going to have people going on social media complaining or criticizing things that they don't like. I think that is just the reality of fighting a war of conscription in a 21st century democracy with social media, with all those ways of kind of, people interacting, sharing their experiences and bringing their criticism of the government to everyone's attention. That is just, I think, par for the course. I think we haven't seen a Western democracy recruiting people, calling people up in the way that Ukraine is doing now in generations. So we wouldn't know how the same would work in the US, in Germany, in the UK.
Thank you guys for the time being, and thanks everyone who has submitted a question until now. Keep them coming, don't be shy. It's super easy to get involved. Just put your questions in the chat on YouTube and we'll put them to Nick and Konstantin. It can be questions about the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Russia, the general geopolitical situation surrounding the war, and of course the work both of them have done as correspondents and experts. But before we continue with questions, we want to talk a little more about the man who started this war. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin was inaugurated for another 6-year term. It was an occasion full of pomp and pageantry, one that marked his 24-year-long rule as Russia's supreme, uncontested leader. He won a landslide election victory in March in a contest considered neither free nor fair and without facing any meaningful opposition. Addressing the Russian people, he also spoke about the war in Ukraine. Let's listen in.
I want to bow before our heroes, the participants of the special military operation, a bow to those who fight. You, the people of Russia, have confirmed the correctness of our country's course. It is of great importance right now when we are faced with hardships. We are a united and great nation. Together we will overcome all obstacles and achieve everything we have planned. Together we will win.
DW's longtime Kyiv correspondent Nick Connolly and our Russia analyst Konstantin Egad are still here with me. Konstantin, when Putin was first inaugurated back in the year 2000, he pledged to preserve and develop democracy and take care of Russia. Would you have predicted that 24 years on, we'd be where we are?
Well, first of all, Nicole, I wouldn't have predicted that in this particular inauguration speech, he will never use the words democracy and freedom. Actually, he used the word freedom only once to denominate or to describe the freedom of Russia. Essentially, it means freedom of the state to do as it pleases. Even in 2018 or before, when his authoritarian tendencies were pretty clear, he still used these key words, maybe as a kind of cheap propaganda to present himself as still adhering to some kind of principles of freedom and democracy. Not anymore. And I think that this is a small symbol, but a significant symbol. Russia is a country on war footing. And of course, in 2000, and I covered that inauguration 24 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that we'll end up with shelling and trenches dug in the Donetsk region and drones hitting Russian cities. I mean, it was completely unimaginable that. I mean, believe me. What I think Putin counts on is actually on the country still being not so much behind him, in a sense that you don't see a lot of lines at the conscription centers in Russia. Actually, there are none. But he counts on the country remaining indifferent and pliant. According to public opinion polls, and admittedly, public opinion polls in Russia cannot be trusted because very frequently people tell the pollsters what they think the authorities would like them to say, but still, about 60% of the population say that they do not follow closely, they do not follow at all the war. This is actually a very good result for Putin, because this means that no one is going to oppose this war. Then the rest of the population, 1/3 of the population, is divided between probably a slight majority that supports Putin and a minority that is against Putin, against the war, probably wants to change the country completely. This is a situation in which Putin can continue to rule through the next 6 years. And I have to remind you that he still has another 6 years according to the constitution that he completely rewrote and made just a worthless piece of paper, in my very, very personal view. So I suppose that so far the Russian society is giving Putin the blank check, and he doesn't even want to hide now that it is a mobilized country at war, not only with Ukraine, but with the West. He made it very clear in his speech today in the Kremlin. He said, we are ready to be, we're ready to talk, we're ready for dialogue with the West. But it depends on the West to drop, and then there was a long list of what the West has to drop, denigrating Russia, not paying attention to its interests, and so on and so forth. And there's another interesting element, which I think is a very important element of Russian propaganda in the last year or so. Putin spoke in this speech again about the majority of the world population being with us. What he means is that countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the so-called global South, they support Russia, or at least they do not like the policies of Ukraine and its Western allies. And I think that this is something that's being rammed down the Russians' throat every day. Look, don't worry what Macron says, what Biden says, what Rishi Sunak says, what the Japanese Prime Minister says. No. We have the whole of the world behind us, and this is what is important. And
let's talk about, sorry to jump in here because we're fast running out of time. We only have about 6 minutes left, and there's some questions that I still want to get to. Twig Attack asked something that I might have asked both of you a number of times. How could the U.S. elections affect Ukraine? Maybe let's start with you, Nick, and I'm sorry to have to ask that of you briefly, if you can.
Well, obviously, there's a huge fear here in Kyiv of a new Trump administration. You'll remember, Trump's first, struggles with, the first time around with Volodymyr Zelensky, asking the Ukrainian president for compromising information investigations into Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. So there's a track record there, and there's a real fear that any kind of Trump deal would basically be depriving Ukraine of resources and forcing Ukraine to accept Russia's terms. So basically, as much as Ukraine is trying to kind of put out its feelers and engage with Republicans, there is only one candidate, and that's Joe Biden, who, in any kind of sense for Ukraine, looks like a kind of hope for continued American support.
Konstantin, who are the Russians rooting for in the upcoming U.S. election?
Let me compensate for my verbosity to you and Nick by saying the United States is not a dictatorship. There are lots of players there, including Congress and public opinion. Let's wait and see. I think that it's not all doom and gloom, even in case Trump wins. I think I have quite big trust in the American institutions and democracy, and in the end, their ability to see who is in the right and who is in the wrong here.
Life Unfiltered has another question for us. What is the world doing to de-escalate the war? Konstantin, maybe if you want to continue.
Well, I think I mentioned it in the beginning. I suppose that you cannot de-escalate here because Putin is all about escalation. The moment you say, well, let's de-escalate, he escalates because that's the only way he knows, and that's the only way he knows he can win. And I suppose that it's at least looking from Central Europe, looking from Warsaw, maybe, by the way, looking from the Nordic states now too. It's not de-escalating that will keep Putin at bay, that will force him to leave Ukraine alone. It is actually showing to Putin that anything he does will be matched and overmatched by the force of Ukraine and its Western allies. De-escalation now, in my personal view, that is just my view, and Nick knows I've been to Ukraine several times, but he works there all the time. I do think de-escalation now will mean a defeat for Ukraine. Putin will play it as basically the West surrendering Ukraine to his mercy, and this is something that cannot be allowed to happen.
Do you want to add something to that, Nick?
Well, certainly when you speak to Ukrainians, when you speak to people fighting, even those who will tell you that they're tired and they haven't been home for the best part of 2 years, they will often tell you that carrying on as is to their mind the least bad alternative. Because the big fear here in Ukraine is that some kind of freezing of the conflict, some kind of let's just leave things as they are for now and figure it out later, will just give Russia an opportunity to rearm. We'll see sanctions dropped or weakened further, and Russia then come back in a few years' time with more resources to finish the job, as it were. I think there's a real fear here that the West doesn't really understand how much of a kind of central project this is for Vladimir Putin, destroying Ukrainian statehood. That's the perception that most Ukrainians you'll speak to have. And they say, we tried freezing the conflict in 2014, and we saw where that got us. We saw Russia holding on to a big chunk of our territory and then coming for more. So there isn't really any kind of clear vision, unless maybe the only alternative would be some kind of NATO membership or guarantee for the territory that Kyiv currently controls. If there was that kind of hard and fast promise, then maybe the Ukrainian population would be more open to some kind of freezing. But for now, it's not something that you see being particularly popular with anyone here.
Mm-hmm. And a final question, I think, because we only have 2 minutes left on the clock. Galen asks, does Ukraine have the military knowledge to defeat Russia? Nick, what do you say?
Well, I think we've seen that Ukrainian soldiers have shown that they're able to learn how to use Western equipment incredibly fast. They've often had a couple of weeks where in most NATO armies they'd have months, if not years, to do the same thing. We have heard that Western countries are sending military attachés, are trying to coordinate more closely to maybe work on some of the strategies, that some of the Ukrainian army performance has been patchier, that in some places the doctrines and the kind of strategy has been cleverer than in other places. These are things we can't really fact check or verify. But for the most part, I think it's important just to remember how few people believed that Ukraine would still be here. Back in 2022, most people thought, even Western friends of Ukraine thought this whole war would be over in a matter of weeks at most. So I think Ukraine has, basically surprised its critics and its kind of naysayers for the best part of the last 2 years.
And that is unfortunately all we have time for today. But I want to thank my guests for sharing their insights. It's always great to be able to pick your brain. And of course, a big thanks to you, our viewers, our users on YouTube, especially those who sent in their questions. Without you, we couldn't do this, and we're hoping to do this more often. Let me know what you thought of this edition of Ask DW. You can leave a comment on our YouTube page. You can also reach out on X, for example, formerly known as Twitter. My handle there is @NicoleFröhlich. I'll be happy to get in touch with you there. Thank you all so much for watching and for participating. Don't forget, there's always more news and information and analysis, of course, like the one we just got from Konstantin and from Nick around the clock on our website. That is dw.com. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.